Okay, so this is the second video that we're using to try and help you understand the logic behind the indirect method of producing a cash flow statement. And so I've just provided some very simplistic data here. This is essentially a transaction worksheet, and you've got the balance at the beginning, which is basically the balance sheet for 2012 in this situation, and a balance sheet for 2013. And we'll walk through and think about how this all fits together so that we can figure out why we're doing the things that we do when we put together the indirect method, use the indirect method to put together a cash flow statement. So let's just look at this kind of. So we've got one event, which is an expense that affected cash. And so cash went down and our net assets went down, so we had an expense. So at this point, our net assets are exactly, the change in net assets is exactly equal to the change in cash. But then other events happen where cash goes down, but that doesn't affect net assets. Sometimes, like here, we paid cash for supplies. Cash went over here to supplies. Here, we paid cash to pay a bill, and our accounts payable went down. So sometimes cash can go down, and some other category is affected, but it doesn't affect the net assets, and that means that this net asset change is going to be different than our cash, our change in cash. It just has to be that way. And then sometimes we have an increase in cash. Like here's an increase in cash right here that would be like a donation because we got this $20 and then here's a $20 revenue. Well, that's great. That the net change in net assets is going to be the same as the change in cash. But here's a change in cash that's associated with finally collecting on some accounts receivable. And then let's see, we've got other increases in cash, like here's an increase in cash from selling some equipment, and here's an increase in cash from having from taking out a mortgage. And so sometimes our cash flows are move in exact lockstep with our net assets, and other times they don't move with our net assets. So we can expect that on a given single transaction like this one, where we paid down cash and it increased our supplies, we would expect that to make a difference. Well, within an organization, eventually you'll consume those supplies, and then there'll be a negative 15 over here in the net asset category. And even though those happen on two separate transactions or multiple transactions, in the end, over time, the cash flow will be the same as in those kinds of events. Will be the cash flow decrease will be the same as the expense transactions. And the same thing with something like accounts payable, right? So we record this accounts payable, that's an expense, but without a cash flow. Well, if we had paid that in this time period, we would have had the cash go down by 40, and the expenses would have showed a net asset decrease of 40. And so because we match expenses and revenues to their increase or increase in asset value, or to their effect on our liabilities, and not to their effect on cash, we necessarily will have a different value in our change in net assets to our change in cash flow. And so the indirect method is a way of backing out the value of the net asset in order to get over here to the value of the change in cash flow. So here we have, I'm just going to zoom out here a little bit. Here we have the change in net assets. Here is a negative $35. The first thing we want to do is add back in any expenses that don't involve cash. So if there's an expense in here that is not going to turn into cash, so like this expense here, let's start here. This expense right here, it involves cash directly, right? This expense here for wage payable, it is not a cash expense right now, but it does involve cash because it will require cash eventually to pay it out, at least in a modern economy. But this expense here, depreciation, does not require cash to be paid, and so we can recognize that we need to add back in the depreciation. So that shouldn't be there. It should be add expenses not requiring depreciation, not requiring cash. One is going to be depreciation. If we had a bad debt or like an allowance for uncollectible, that could be here as well. So we're going to add that back in. And then we need to make any kind of other adjustments for these situations like this wages payable, this accounts payable where we paid down the accounts payable but it didn't affect cash, and where we pay this, or where we cash out some accounts receivable but it didn't affect our revenues. It would have been a revenue in a prior time period. And then this cash for supplies. So those are all events that we need to make an adjustment from what the net asset value shows to what the cash value shows. And those adjustments are what we dealt with in the other video. So we are going to increase our liabilities. Any change to a liability account that increases, we want to add that back in. So we're going to add our wages payable back in, and that's worth $40. And any liability decrease, see, that affected that's required our cash to go down, but it didn't affect our net assets. So we're going to just look down here and see what's the difference from 20 to 5. So then there's a negative 15. So we're going to subtract the accounts payable. Then we want to go over here to the accounts receivable and supplies, and we'll see here that we had a decrease in our accounts receivable of $10, and so we're going to add back in. See here, if we had a decrease in a non-cash asset category, we're going to add that back in. So we're going to add in our accounts receivable value of $10, and then we're going to subtract the increase in supplies. This required it didn't affect our net asset value, but so we want to subtract it to get to where effect it had on our cash. So subtract 15, and then the net cash used for operating activities is going to be the sum of these values, negative 10. So we did go up by $100 in cash, but the reduction of but we spent more cash than we brought in during this time period. So then we also want to look here at net cash used for investing activities, or let's say from investing activities, and just to speed up a little bit here, I'm not gonna write down each one of these inputs like I did here. It's a little more intuitive here. So investing activities are buying and selling stocks and bonds, or buying and selling capital assets. And so here are our investing transactions, our capital assets. We don't have a long-term investment or long-term securities account. That would be included as well. And so we spent $100 and we brought in $200. So the sum of those two is going to be our net cash flows from investing activities. And then our net cash from financing activities is associated with paying down the principal of our debts and taking out long-term debts in order to obtain cash or money. And so we'll take the sum of these two values. So right here, this is our net cash flows from those different sources, and if we sum them, we're gonna just get the $10 increase from financing, and the 10 is essentially offsetting this operating loss, and then the $100 increase is mostly associated with having sold an asset and buying another one that's a lot cheaper, or we don't know if it's exactly a replacement situation here, but essentially we can see that we covered an operating loss with having borrowed money, and we have all of our positive cash increase comes from having sold some equipment and not having purchased as much as we sold. And this helps us understand that that this is a problematic situation, because we are only keeping our cash liquidity levels up by selling assets, and we can't do that forever. So I hope that's helpful. Well,